Hello, I'm Stan Takis of New Byzantium Publications, and this is one of our video lesson series of presentations that offer educational information for modern Orthodox Church musicians. Today's topic is a short history of music in the Christian Church. Our mission at newbiz.org is to focus on lay choirs, choir directors, and beginning chanters, primarily in English-speaking countries, who are perhaps in a place or situation where the materials they need to do their jobs well may be hard to find. All of the information in these video presentations has been thoroughly researched and represents generally accepted knowledge. The purpose is not to be exhaustive in this information, but to establish fundamentals that make our tasks as church musicians more meaningful, and thus motivate us to do the best job that we can in fulfilling our roles in the collective life of Orthodox Christians. Why is it important to know about the history of church music? After 2,000 years of church history, many things have happened that directly affect the way we worship today. There have been many outside influences on church life in those years. And since the Orthodox Church, longer than any other Christian denomination, has defended and protected the doctrines and teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ, it is important to know how it has resisted worldly influences that may threaten the basis of our faith. The role of the Christian musician, whether it be in a choir loft or at a chanter stand, is the same for all. We are charged with leading the congregation in the singing of hymns and in the hearing and following of prayers by the congregation and poems and stories that tell us of our history and of our faith, so that we may cling to them as we live our lives in this world, and that we may prepare our way to the next world. Our journey begins with the musical practices of the ancient Hebrews who preceded the establishment of the Christian Church. Our faith began with the Jewish people of the Old Testament. The basic fact of how God communicated with his people and how they worshipped him are to be found there. This time also prepared the way for the Messiah, Jesus Christ, to Christians, who to appear on the earth and to teach us how we should live our lives. Music was important in the religious faith of the Hebrews. It was primarily vocal. The music was the servant of the words. Hebrew texts were rich in theology. Musical instruments were employed, but not to accompany singing. They might have trumpets or horns to call people to worship, or harps may have been used to support the readings of the prophecies. Singing, however, was for studying the scriptures and attaining understanding. Singing was worship, and not a background to anything. The elaborate and sensuous music of the world was shunned. The Jews participated in religious meals, such as the Kiddush, the Chaborah, and the Seder, where believers would gather in fellowship. These meals included the singing of psalms or songs. There was a Thanksgiving ceremony. It's interesting to note here that Eucharist is the Greek word for Thanksgiving, portending the development of the Divine Liturgy in later years. There were blessings, and at the evening meal, a lamp-lighting ceremony. Through the day, specific hours of prayer were observed. Beyond the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, King David's book of 150 Psalms was central to the worship of the Hebrews and consequently to the early Christians as well. everyone was encouraged to study and sing the Psalms. The singing was in unison and often antiphonal between a verse sung by the rabbi or the cantor, followed by a refrain or a trope that was sung by the people together. An example of this in Orthodox Christian worship is the Pallielios, where verses from Psalm 135 are chanted, followed by the people's response of, "For his mercy endures forever." You would hear a verse and then, "For his mercy endures forever," from the people, and back and forth. Besides being used throughout Jewish services, the Psalms were also used for personal devotions. The musical practices of the Hebrews and how it was followed by the early Christians was summed up by St. John Chrysostom in one of his homilies on 1 Corinthians. St. John was the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 4th century. He said, "For in truth there ought to be but one voice in the church always, even as there is one body. For that reason the reader utters his voice alone, and the bishop himself is content to sit in silence, and the chanter sings alone, and though all answer, the voices carry up as if from one mouth." Let's now take a look at some historical and scriptural references made to music in the early Christian church. We've already established that they drew heavily from the Hebrew practices. The Gospel tells us that at the Last Supper, hymns were sung. The book of Ephesians encourages us to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. This passage figures greatly in the future path of Orthodox Christian musical practices. Whereas, for example, psalms and hymns were sung in a syllabic way, 1 or 2 notes per syllable, spiritual songs were more spontaneous, and melody itself gained a more important role. There is an ancient musical book of the early Christians called the Asmatikon, where texts of very few syllables, such as "Lord have mercy" or "Alleluia," are chanted to long melismatic melodies, thus foreshadowing the papotic hymns of our current worship, such as cherubic and communion hymns. Some of these hymns were wordless and just used random syllables. If we take a look at the historical trajectory of the evening religious meal, the early Christians came to call it the agape, or the love feast. Some of the oldest Christian hymns are to be found in the agape. Phos Ilaron, or O Joyful Light, was sung at the lamp lighting. The small doxology, Doxa Patri, or Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, etc., also had its origin here. The writing of new hymns was at first discouraged, but the cultures of new people converted to the faith began to have influence on musical practices. The Greeks and the Syrians in particular had a culture of hymn singing in their pagan religions, and in order to attract new catechumens, the church fathers in the 4th century decided to allow the singing of new hymns. This led to a great flowering of texts with beautiful poetry enriching the church's music. The services and ceremonies of the church expanded as well. The Eucharist of the agape meal became separated from the evening service, and it became the divine liturgy later, when the meal itself is the sacrament of Holy Communion. The agape meal became the Vesper service. The early Christians believed the second coming of Christ was imminent, and they believed he would return on a Sunday, the day of his resurrection. In those days, a new day began at sundown, when the Vespers hour would begin. And after Vespers, an all-night vigil was kept to await the return of Jesus. And if by morning it was not yet time for it, the Divine Liturgy was given instead to continue the Last Supper, where Christ told his disciples to do this in remembrance of me. And so thus the tradition of a Sunday morning Divine Liturgy commemorating the resurrection of Christ was established. The Orthros, or the morning service, also known as Matins in the Latin West, was actually the last part of the all-night vigil. The vigil is a rare practice of the modern church today, but the Orthros does remain. We're now going to move on to important events that revealed the musical practices of the early church and how some of the traditions we use today became established. To understand this, we need to look at the historical background of what happened during this period. In the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine had created a new capital city in Byzantium, a fishing village on the Bosporus and Dardanelles, the dividing line between Europe and Asia. This was a strategic location for defending the eastern part of the empire. Constantine was the first Christian emperor, and he made the religion legal and official, and the official belief of Romans and of the empire itself. His mother was the one who found the original cross. She was a Christian and had a great influence on him. In 325, he convened the First Ecumenical Council in Nicaea to clearly define the doctrines and the beliefs of the Christian Church. Now, in the year 363, the Emperor Julian, the last of the line from Constantine's family, had attempted to revive pagan worship and the persecution of Christians. And he waged a war against Persians and died on a battlefield of that war. His assistant, Jovian, who was a Christian, was elected to be the new emperor by the military leaders. And Jovian made a peace with the Persians that was really not favorable to Rome. He was quickly succeeded by Valentinian I, who realized that the threat to the eastern part of the empire and the Christian church there by the Persians, so he made his brother Valens the emperor of the East. This was the beginning of the split in the empire, and subsequently the church into East and West. In the year 363 also, the bishops, the Christian bishops in Asia Minor, convened a synod council in Laodicea in the province of Phrygia to firm up the practices of the Christian church and guard against heresy and outside influences. They concentrated on a few basic tenets like the personal conduct of the clergy and the laity. Priests, for example, were required to wear clerical clothing all the time and not go to bars or taverns. Sunday was set as the new Sabbath day, or the day of rest and worship. Restrictions on the lives of believers during the Lenten period were established. That's where we get a lot of our fasting rules. There was a declaration of what were the official books of the New Testament and the Bible, as had been begun at Nicaea. Many of the familiar practices of the Greek Orthodox Church today can be found in the canons of the Council of Laodicea. Of importance to church musicians, The 15th canon revealed the singing rules that had been put into place. It reads, "No others shall sing in the church, save only the ordained singers who go up into the ambo and sing from a book." This may have come about from the proliferation of hymns and perhaps maybe a cacophony in the church when the hymns were being sung, that they felt perhaps they felt they had to do something about it. The ambo was a high platform built in the middle of the congregation so that sermons and prayers could be easily heard by all of the people. When the invention of new architecture and sound amplification came about, we no longer have an ambo now, but the important parts of this canon for church musicians are the other things that were revealed. In order to avoid the cacophony, only ordained chanters were allowed to sing, and in an indication that there was an orderly program of hymns, these chanters had to sing from a book. Let's move on to the development of hymns. Early hymn writers in the Christian church included the Emperor Justinian, whose summary of Christian beliefs, Only Begotten Son, is still sung today in the Divine Liturgy, O Monogenisios. Another is Ephraim the Syrian, who was a great theologian and a writer. There was Saint Romanos the Melodist, a great poet from the 6th century. He's considered today as a patron of church musicians. This time is called the Golden Age of church hymnography. The Divine Liturgy also continued to be developed. The Eucharistic liturgies of many different towns in the empire had their own things. They were generally the same, but there were a few differences. They were compiled and edited in the 4th century by St. John Chrysostom, again, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and other liturgies that have survived besides St. John's to the present day are the Liturgy of the Pre-Sanctified Gifts, the Liturgy of St. Basil, which is given during Lent and on a few other occasions, like January 1st, St. Basil's Day, and the Liturgy of St. James, which is given once a year on October 23rd, the feast day of St. James. Now in Jerusalem, where the Christian church there was established by St. James, it's performed more often there. It is the longest of all the liturgies. It takes a few hours to do. Monastic communities were begun during this period, and they flourished during the early years of the church. Groups of ascetics would remove themselves from the world and live in these isolated religious communities, keeping the hours of prayer daily and writing many of the hymns that are still chanted today. They wielded an important influence on the churches in the larger cities. The early church always resisted the influence of the secular world. We read in Aristotle about the musical practices of the ancient Greeks. This part of the known world had many different and diverse musical modes and scales. Each city-state in Greece had its own distinctive music. Much of this music was passionate and theatrical, and there were even competitions between the city-states, musical competitions. And the fathers of the church deemed much of it inappropriate for Christian worship. It was St. John of Damascus, a very important theologian of the 9th century, who codified the system of 8 musical tones which were appropriate for church hymns that we use today. Each tone is a family of musical modes, scales, melodic patterns that evoke reverent, prayerful, or repentant emotions. This 8-tone system, the octoikos, is a foundation for music in the Orthodox Church. Each tone is highlighted in an 8-week rotation that lasts throughout the church year. We're going to look at the first millennium of the Orthodox Church as a whole. Many forms of hymns were established and developed. Let's take a brief look at some of the more important ones. First, there were the Troparia, which is the plural word for a troparion. These were the tropes, or the refrains, that originated in the ancient singing of the Psalms. They developed into a genre of its own, given the new hymns that were written and used as refrains. We often call a hymn that is repeated frequently as a refrain or a troparion. For example, Christos Anesti. That's a hymn that is repeated a lot and very often as a refrain during the Paschal services. The Apolotikia, which is plural for apolitikion, derived their name from the apolesis, or the dismissal of the Vespers service. Throughout a Vespers service, the saint or event that is being celebrated on that day receives many laudatory hymns that are summed up and condensed into one short hymn that is sung at the dismissal. This is the Apolitikion. Throughout the calendar of the church, there are hundreds of these hymns. The Apolitikia of the day are repeated at the beginning of Orthros and at the small entrance of the Divine Liturgy. They are the only hymns that appear in all three services. The Kondakia, plural for kondakion, have an interesting history. They were very long poems originally, commemorating saints or events in the life of Christ. They flourished in the 6th century around the time of St. Romanos, who composed many of them. They consisted of a brief prelude, followed by another brief hymn called the Ikos, and this is followed by a long series of strophes that make up the main body of the poem. The first letter of each of these strophes form an acrostic, often the name of the saint or the event, or as in the case of the only surviving complete kondakion in the Greek Orthodox Church, the kondakion of the Annunciation, which is celebrated on the first 5 Fridays of Lent and is referred to as the salutations to the Theotokos, in Greek the Charismi, or as the Akathist hymn, the standing hymn. The acrostic for this kondakion is the Greek alphabet. I heard in one place that the word kondakion was a word that meant a pole, and that these long hymns were put on scrolls attached to a pole so everybody could read the whole thing before the service. But I don't know if that's true. That's interesting, though, to me. The only existing part of the kondakia today are the prelude and the ikos we spoke of. Those are read at Orthros, the Orthros service, and the prelude, which is chanted in the Divine Liturgy after the Apolitikion and the small entrance. As I indicated earlier, these kondakia are seasonal. They celebrate festal seasons, events, saints. For example, during Lent, the kondakion we sing in the liturgy is Ti Iparmacho, Mighty Defender, in honor of the Annunciation. During the nativity period, the Advent to Nativity and Nativity itself, the kondakion is I Parthenos Simeron. During the Paschal season, it's often Ike and Tafo. On days outside of seasonal and feasts, Lisande kondakion is prostasia ton Christianon. It's a kondakion to the Theotokos, or protection of Christians. Another important type of hymn in the Orthodox Church is the canon. Canon in Greek, but I'm going to refer to it as canon. There are 9 songs or prayerful poems in the Bible that were identified early by Christians as canticles. These 9 canticles were always chanted during the all-night vigil, and over time, extra hymns and troparia became attached to them as commentaries and devotions on the subject matter of each of the canticles. These devotions took the form of odes, and each ode contained a series of verses. The first ode was referred to as the irmos, which established the melody for the remaining verses of the ode. The irmos was then normally repeated at the end of each ode, and this became known as they became known as the katavasias. Today in our Orthodox services, our Orthros service, we only usually sing the katavasias of the daily canon, and not the complete canon. Sometimes there's more than one even, which is only done on special occasions, but they are still done. We know about the one at the Akathis service. There's a canon in there. There's one in the Paraclesis. Okay, if we look at these 9 canticles, so we may understand the subject matter of each ode of a canon. The first canticle is the Song of Moses from Exodus. The second is the second Song of Moses from Deuteronomy. The subject of this song is God's wrath at the Hebrews and is usually skipped in the canons, except for the Lenten period where penitence for sins is emphasized. So we will hear some of the second odes during Lent. The third canticle is the prayer of Hannah from 1 Samuel. The fourth is the prayer of Habakkuk. The fifth is the prayer of Isaiah. The sixth is the prayer of Jonah in the belly of the whale. And the seventh and eighth canticles are from the book of Daniel and concern the 3 holy youths in the fiery furnace. The 9th canticle is the only one from the New Testament. There are 2 songs in the Gospel of Luke that comprise this canticle. The first being the Megalinarion, called the Magnificat in the Western Church, where Mary the Theotokos sings, "My soul magnifies the Lord," and that she will be called blessed by many generations. It's a beautiful poem that everyone should read frequently. Shortly thereafter, she visits her relative Elizabeth, whom, as told to Mary by the angel Gabriel, is in her 6th month of pregnancy with John the Baptist, whom we call the forerunner. Elizabeth's husband, Zacharias, sings a song that begins, "Blessed by," and so because of that, it was referred to in the Latin West as the Benedictus, and it's a familiar hymn in Christianity. At this point in the history of the Christian Church, we must deal with the split, or schism, in the Church that resulted in the establishment of 2 separate churches, the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox churches. This schism had great repercussions that influenced the music of Christians. So let's take a look at them. We have learned that in the 4th century, the Roman Empire was divided into East and West, with 2 capital cities, Rome and Constantinople. As a Christian, Constantine established an alliance between the empire and the church, and subsequent emperors and patriarchs worked together to preserve the tenets of the Christian Church. There were 5 large cities of the empire that were the centers of church administration. Each city had a patriarch that held a line of succession to one of the apostles of Christ. St. Mark in Alexandria, Egypt, St. Peter in Antioch, Syria, St. Andrew in Byzantium, which became Constantinople, St. James in Jerusalem, and Saints Peter and Paul in Rome. In the first millennium of the Church, these 5 patriarchs were considered equals in authority. However, by the 11th century, the Patriarch of Rome, or the Pope as he was referred to by the Latins, began a spurious claim that he had final authority over the other patriarchs because of the Petrine doctrine, which held that because Jesus Christ had called St. Peter the rock upon which he would build his church, the Pope would have particular authority over them. The other patriarchs did not agree, and they held that all the final decisions on church doctrine and practice were, up to that point, decided in the ecumenical councils. Well, what happened was anathemas were exchanged, and in the year 1054, the Great Schism occurred. The Western Church became known as the Catholic Church, and the Eastern jurisdictions became known as the Orthodox churches. The Orthodox, in the ensuing centuries, heeded the previous musical practices that we have described heretofore. But in the West, church music experiences many innovative changes. The stage had been set in the 6th century by Pope Gregory the Great, who codified the 8 tones of the church music to adapt to the Latin language of the Latin liturgy, which we know as the Mass. This music is referred today as Gregorian Chant. There were other forms of chant that also emerged in the West, such as Ambrosian chant. But after the Great Schism, in the 11th century, the changes to music in the West began in earnest, and there were big departures from the Orthodox traditions. First, polyphony, or harmonized music employing many different vocal lines, became a standard. There was also a significant change in the notation of music. Instead of a single line of neumes or symbols that indicated pitch, accents, and intervals of a melody with the words, as was used in the East, the Western musicians developed the idea of a musical staff of 4 lines upon which the neumes would be placed to indicate pitch and rhythm. This eventually developed into the worldwide standard of staff notation that we know today. With the advent of the Renaissance and the lifting of the Dark Ages, both secular and sacred music changed drastically in the West, with each side affecting the other. A secular form of music known as the motet found its way into the church. The use of pipe organs and even other instruments was introduced and firmly established to accompany the 4 or more parts of the polyphonic choirs. The polyphony itself became more complex, thus blurring and obscuring the clear expression of the texts, which were gradually not being understood at all anyway because of the dying of Latin as a vernacular language. Music took on a new importance for the emotional lives of the lay people in the church. In the 14th century, Pope John the 22nd complained that this complicated music was, quote, distorted by a multitude of notes, intoxicating rather than soothing the ears. Devotion is brought into contempt, and wantonness is increased. He also said, yet we do not intend to forbid some concords which enrich the melody. So he sort of wanted a watered down kind of polyphony that didn't obscure things. But nevertheless, the 15th and 16th centuries saw more explosive changes in Western music, including increased secular influence and more polyphonic voices. Then when the Protestant Reformation of the Western Church came about, more changes were instituted. Martin Luther brought back congregational singing of the Psalms and of new hymns, some written by Luther himself. And many of these hymns were derived from German secular songs. Finally, in the late 16th century, there was an attempt by the cardinals of the Catholic Church to ban polyphony in the Council of Trent and return to the chants of the early church. The Pope at the time, Marcellus, was leaning toward doing just that, but one of the great church composers of the Italian Renaissance, Giovanni De Palestrina, wrote a simple polyphonic mass of great beauty and sent it to Marcellus, who was so swayed by its charms that he denied the attempt to ban polyphony. So let's look at the modern era in general that came from the Renaissance. After the Renaissance, there were no holds barred. The Western Church and its music, along with it, split into thousands of pieces. The different Protestant sects began to proliferate, and as we've seen, during the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic Church, that included the attempt to simplify the music, which failed at the Council of Trent. Secular and popular forms of religious music came into society, such as oratorios and cantatas. Johann Sebastian Bach, in fact, wrote over 100 cantatas for the churches in which he was the appointed minister of music and composer in the 17th and 18th centuries. Secular composers such as Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and their successors wrote grand concert masses based upon the ordinary parts of the Catholic service. The Romantic movement in Western music saw its share of concert pieces made up of masses, requiems, magnificats, stabat maters, all these secular composers composing sacred music. These secular influences even influenced composers in the Orthodox East. In the 17th century, Tsar Peter the Great of Russia, who had been educated in the West and was a great admirer of their music, he sent his court composers to Italy to learn it and to bring it back for use in the Russian Orthodox Church. Composers such as Bortniansky, Brechyaninov, and even later Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, and Stravinsky in the 20th century wrote grand religious works based on Western music and combined it with the traditions of the Russian Church. So they sound a bit traditional, but they're composed by these secular composers. So what do we think was the reaction to the great musical changes in the post-industrial West? An example of the Orthodox attitude occurred in 1846 in the Greek Orthodox Church of Vienna, Austria, the center of Western music at the time. The congregation there had begun chanting music of the Divine Liturgy in 4-part harmony. And Patriarch Anthimos of Constantinople had to issue an encyclical banning it. In the Catholic Church, near the end of the 19th century, Pope Pius X, concerned that the pagan music of Richard Wagner's operas might infiltrate the church, called for a revival of the traditional musical practices of Gregorian Chant, male choirs, and Eucharistic piety. In the Russian Orthodox Church, all of this new music that had been introduced by Western-influenced composers had turned the Divine Liturgy into basically choir concerts, the content of which was controlled by the choir directors. A synod had to be called in 1905, in fact, to find ways to stop this trend from happening. A simpler kind of chant was recommended, and while there are many different kinds of Slavonic chant based on the old Znameni chants that were derived from the Byzantine, the chant of the so-called Obichod variety has become a standard. It includes an 8-tone homophonically harmonized system based on some traditional melodic formulas and recitatives on block chords. And when we go to a Russian church today, that's pretty much what we hear. Meanwhile, back in other parts of the Orthodox East, in Greece, Asia Minor, and the Middle East, where Byzantine chant was the official music, there were natural developments, such as the beautification of melismatic chanting, influenced by St. John Cucuzelis in the 14th century, the Crusades, and the advance of Islam, leading to the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, had an effect on the entire church. Modern scholars are not in agreement as to how much of an influence Turkish music had on Byzantine chant, but there must have been some of it both ways. That's really another topic for discussion. In the early 19th century, Chrysanthos of Maditos wrote a new method. He called it a new method for the theory and notation of Byzantine chant, because there were so many different ways that it was being done by that time. And this new method has become a standard in the modern world. And later in the 19th century, the Athenian chanter John Sakalarides introduced staff notation and harmony to Byzantine music, with great implications, especially in America, where Sakalarides' music had found great favor with the American archdiocese. The Greek immigrants in America were greatly influenced by the desire to fit in with the Catholic and Protestant religions of the New World, and they began to adopt some of the Western practices, such as secular clothing for priests, pews in the churches and electric lights, and lay choirs accompanied by electric organs for the Divine Liturgy. Western-style composers wrote hymnals of music for these lay choirs that strayed further and further away from the ancient traditions. The use of the American vernacular languages of English in the United States and Spanish in other places, and in French in Quebec and Haiti also posed several problems for the traditionalists in the Orthodox Church. So now that we're more familiar with our musical history, where do we go from here? That is a question I will not try to answer, because firstly, I don't know what the answer is. And secondly, the mission of New Byzantium Publications is not to decide these matters, but only to help people decide for themselves what are the true Orthodox musical traditions that will best serve the Church in the future. That is another chapter of history that is still being written. And with that, I will say goodbye for now. If you have any comments or suggestions concerning this video, please go to www.newbiz.org on the internet, where you may find all of our contact information.